Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 2011 movie titled Trespass. Please be advised that there will be spoilers ahead. In the opening scene, we are introduced to Mr. Miller, an extremely wealthy diamond merchant who lives with his wife, Mrs. Miller, and their teenage daughter, Lily, in a luxurious suburban villa. Recently, Mr. Miller has been busy with work and is rarely home. One evening, he manages to return home on time. Mrs. Miller, excited, prepares a lavish dinner and dresses up, hoping for a pleasant family meal. Unexpectedly, Mr. Miller announces he has to leave for a business meeting and can't stay for dinner. Mrs. Miller, feeling dejected, listens as Mr. Miller explains perfunctorily that his hard work is all for their family. But his words do little to comfort her. She has heard similar excuses countless times before. As Mr. Miller prepares to leave, the intercom rings. A man, claiming to be a police officer investigating a nearby home invasion, asks to speak clearly, but he notices the badge on his uniform. Without suspicion, he opens the gate and tells Mrs. Miller to fetch Lily from her room. Lily, going through her rebellious phase, had been arguing with her parents because they refused to let her attend a wild party hosted by a wealthy friend. Angry, she locked herself in her room. Mrs. Miller knocks repeatedly, but there's no response. Using a spare key, she enters and finds the room empty. Lily had sneaked out through the back door. Suddenly, Mr. Miller shouts from downstairs, urging his wife to run. The police officers are actually three men and a woman disguised in fake uniforms. The robbers quickly subdue Mr. and Mrs. Miller, destroy all communication devices, and drag the couple to the study. There, they pull a painting off the wall, revealing a hidden safe. They demand Mr. Miller disclose the code, claiming they know it holds valuable diamonds. The leader of the robbers warns that if Mr. Miller doesn't cooperate, Mrs. Miller will pay the price. Mr. Miller, however, calmly explains that every diamond in circulation is certified by the Jewelry Association. Details like weight, shape, and ownership are engraved on each stone, making it easy to trace. He argues that stolen diamonds would lose value because no buyer would pay full price for illicit goods. Instead, Mr. Miller proposes a collaboration. They stage a robbery, file for insurance claims, and he removes identifying marks from the diamonds to sell them new. This way, no one gets hurt, and everyone profits. The leader hesitates but is interrupted by a younger member who accuses Mr. Miller of stalling. The young robber claims to have seen Mr. Miller receive a package of diamonds and a large sum of cash recently. He suggests abandoning the diamonds and just cashing in instead. At this moment, Mrs. Miller recognizes the young robber's voice and physique. It's the same man who recently installed their security system. She remembers him as a charming and handsome technician. Realizing how the robbers know so much about their home, she keeps quiet, fearing they might kill her to silence any witnesses. The robbers continue pressuring Mr. Miller for the code, but he refuses, believing the code is their only leverage to stay alive. Frustrated, the leader threatens to inject Mr. and Mrs. Miller with a sedative, claiming they just want money, not lives. The couple would wake up safely once the robbery was over. Mr. Miller remains skeptical, refusing to cooperate unless they let his wife go. Tempers flare when a violent robber loses patience. Holding a knife to Mrs. Miller's throat, he threatens to kill her immediately. Panicking, Mr. Miller doesn't expect the young robber to intervene. The young man, infatuated with Mrs. Miller, can't bear to see her hurt. He draws a gun and points it at his companion, creating a tense standoff. To prevent internal conflict, the leader moves Mrs. Miller to the kitchen. The leader, who is the young robber's older brother, knows about his sibling's obsession with Mrs. Miller. Moreover, it seems Mrs. Miller and the younger brother share a secret flirtatious relationship. Using this as leverage, the leader blackmails Mrs. Miller to convince her husband to hand over the code. She reluctantly agrees but secretly pockets a sedative syringe from the leader's pocket. As they return to the study, a voice suddenly echoes from the living room. It's Lily, calling for her mother. Mrs. Miller screams for her daughter to run, but it's too late. The robbers quickly capture her. An unstable, drug-addicted rich kid hosted the party Lily attended. Seeing Lily's beauty, he opened his drug stash and invited her to join him in getting high. Lily, unwilling to hang out with the troublemaker at the party, leaves midway and sneaks back home through the back door. However, she unexpectedly stumbles into the ongoing robbery, becoming an additional hostage. The robbers finally reunite the family of three and begin playing on their emotions. The leader asserts that his sick, impoverished mother has endured severe abuse at the hands of her father. She needs $180,000 for a kidney transplant, and that's why he had to resort to robbing the Miller family. He threatens that if Mr. Miller doesn't give up the safe's code, he will take one of Lily's kidneys. Upon hearing this threat against her daughter, Mrs. Miller snaps. She grabs the robber leader's neck with one hand and pulls out a syringe with the other. The leader had previously said that the sedative was intended to knock all three of them unconscious, but if injected into one person, it could kill them. Mrs. Miller threatens the other three robbers to let Lily go or she will kill their leader. The robbers reluctantly comply but immediately threaten Mr. Miller that if he doesn't open the safe, they will bring Lily back. Mrs. Miller, on the verge of breaking down, screams at her husband to comply. Finally, Mr. Miller gives in, to everyone's shock. The safe is empty. The robbers and Mrs. Miller are stunned. Mr. Miller admits that he was fired by his boss and is now bankrupt. The villa is about to be repossessed by the bank for failure to repay the mortgage. The diamonds and cash the robbers had seen earlier were not his. He had been surviving on a small commission as a diamond broker. The robbers don't believe him and force him to reveal where he hid any other money. They then bring Lily back. Lily is unable to leave the villa far enough to seek help due to its isolation and lack of neighbors. The young robber recalls that Mr. Miller has a prized silver suitcase. They open it, but inside? There are only diamond certification files, not money. The leader, frustrated and angry, beats Mr. Miller and threatens to remove Lily's kidney. Mr. Miller still insists he has no money and offers to give up his own kidney instead, pleading not to hurt his daughter. The leader, in a fit of rage, holds Mr. Miller down, drawing a knife and making it look like he's about to perform the surgery. But seeing that Mr. Miller shows no resistance, the leader hesitates. It turns out the leader's mother had died years ago from alcohol abuse. His earlier claim that she was sick and needed a kidney transplant was a lie, meant to elicit sympathy from Mr. Miller's point. The truth is that Mr. Miller is either really broke or values money more than his life. Seeing that Mr. Miller will not budge, the robbers search the house for more valuables. They notice a photo of Mrs. Miller wearing an expensive diamond necklace. They tie up Mr. Miller and Lily again, forcing Mrs. Miller to lead them to the necklace. While the robbers are distracted, Mr. Miller and Lily use a lighter to try to burn through the tape binding their hands. The robbers find the necklace, but seeing that there is nothing else of value in the house, they remove their masks, preparing to kill the family and leave. Mrs. Miller takes the chance to secretly tell the young robber that if he saves Lily, she will let him do whatever he wants. Infatuated with Mrs. Miller, the young man immediately rushes to convince his brother, the leader, to spare her. For his brother's happiness, the leader tells the female robber to take Lily to the bedroom. He decides to kill Mr. Miller in front of Mrs. Miller to break her spirit, ensuring she will follow his brother from then on. Unexpectedly, Mr. Miller makes another startling confession. The necklace Mrs. Miller is wearing is a fake. The real one had already been sold to pay off debts. He explains that the real diamond is incredibly hard, and if they hit the necklace, they can tell it's fake. The leader, skeptical, tries it, and the necklace shatters. At this moment, the leader's mindset crumbles. In a fit of rage, he reveals to Mr. Miller that he and the female robber are a couple and that they are both drug dealers. A few days earlier, they were robbed by masked men who took $180,000 worth of goods. The mafia boss who supplied the goods is threatening them, demanding they pay back the money or they will die. The violent robber is actually the mafia boss's subordinate, sent to monitor them. The leader now insists that he must get money from Mr. Miller to cover his debts or they will all die together. But Mr. Miller continues to deny having any money. The female robber then finds a photo in Mr. Miller's suitcase of the young robber kissing Mrs. Miller. It seems Mr. Miller already knew about the affair. This explains why he is so stubborn. Perhaps because he's lost all hope and doesn't want to live anymore. At this standoff, the mafia boss calls again, demanding his money. The leader vents all his frustration on Mr. Miller. Mrs. Miller rushes to protect her husband, only to be knocked down. The young robber, furious that his goddess is hurt, rushes to save her. The leader, growing impatient, confronts his brother. The tension reaches its peak as the young robber, whose mental instability has been building up, is provoked by his brother's comment. His emotional state escalates, and he almost fights his brother. Just then, the doorbell rings. It's a security guard from the security company who came to verify the house after the alarm was triggered earlier. Although the robbers had deactivated it, the company protocol required a signature from the owner to confirm everything was fine, or else they would have to call the police. Thinking quickly, the leader of the gang pretends to be Mr. Miller to sign off, but the young robber, who has mental issues, follows him outside and immediately shoots the security guard. He then uses the guard's walkie-talkie to call the security company and falsely claims that the signature was obtained and everything is fine. The robber leader realizes that his brother is becoming uncontrollable and decides it's best to kill Mr. Miller and leave. However, before he can act, Lily suddenly offers to help the robbers get money in exchange for sparing her father. She reveals that at the party earlier, she discovered that a wealthy drug user has a lot of money in his home safe, easily over $200,000. The desperate leader decides to take action immediately. He orders the female robber to go with Lily to the rich man's house. Meanwhile, the young robber stays behind, trying to persuade Mrs. Miller to join him after everything is over. He promises to treat her and Lily well. While driving to the rich man's house, Lily subtly releases the female robber's seatbelt and purposely crashes the car into a utility pole, killing the robber instantly. Despite minor injuries, Lily successfully seizes the robber's gun. Back at the house, the previously unconscious violent robber wakes up and sees the young robber trying to take Mrs. Miller. He rushes to stop him, but the young robber, despite his mental issues, is overpowered and quickly gets strangled. The leader, seeing this, comes in and shoots the violent robber in the neck, killing him before the latter reveals a shocking secret. The masked robbers who took the $180,000 worth of goods were actually the mafia boss himself. And the young robber had been the mastermind behind the entire plan. The young robber's goal was to force his brother into a corner so that he could get him to rob Mr. Miller's house and eventually win over the woman he loved, Mrs. Miller. With his plan exposed, the young robber tries to explain, but, at that moment, Mr. and Mrs. Miller seize the opportunity to escape and hide in a storeroom under construction. Mr. Miller, injured, urges his wife to escape and call the police for help. However, just as Mrs. Miller's about to leave, the robber leader stops her. The young robber follows and gets into a struggle with his brother. In the chaos, the two knock over a panel revealing a pile of cash. It turns out Mr. Miller had been hiding a large sum of money. Upon seeing the cash, the leader decides to kill Mr. Miller and take the. Just then, Lily arrives. And realizing the female robber is likely dead, the leader switches his target and aims to kill Lily instead. However, the young robber, in a moment of clarity, shoots his brother to save Lily. The leader is killed. Lily is stunned and confused by the situation, but the young robber seizes her gun and takes control. He once again tries to convince Mrs. Miller to leave with him, claiming that Mr. Miller hid the money because he knew about their affair and was preparing to divorce her. Mrs. Miller, now realizing how hard her husband has worked, learns that he kept the money to leave something for his family after selling the necklace. The real truth comes to light. The young robber had used his position at work to steal surveillance footage of Mrs. Miller and used it to manipulate Mr. Miller into thinking she had been unfaithful. Despite this, Mr. Miller silently bore the pain and never confronted his wife. After hearing everything, Mr. Miller decides to set fire to the money and give his family an escape. He lights a fire with a nearby lighter, and the flames quickly spread. As the money burns, the young robber tries to salvage some of it, but Mr. Miller takes advantage of the moment and uses a nail gun to pin the young robber's foot to the ground. The young robber, enraged, raises his gun to kill Mr. Miller, but Mrs. Miller intervenes, standing in front of her husband. The young robber, desperate, lowers his gun and attempts to embrace Mrs. Miller for a final death, but Mr. Miller picks up the gun and shoots him dead. With the young robber dead, Mrs. Miller and Mr. Miller help each other escape the fire. Their family, after all they've endured, embraces each other tightly. They have reduced the money to ashes, but it no longer matters to them and the movie ends. Thank you for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.